During the darkest years of the Second World War, when the skies over Europe became a perpetual stage of fire and steel, the pilots of the Luftwaffe faced not only the Allied bombers advancing toward the heart of Germany, but also a far more complex reality: the silent decisions that defined the boundary between duty and humanity. As the Allied air campaign intensified, German cities became the targets of systematic bombardment. From the daylight raids of the USAAF to the nighttime assaults of the RAF, thousands of bombers crossed the skies, leaving behind trails of smoke, destruction, and twisted metal. In that context, the Luftwaffe fought an uneven war. Each mission meant taking off outnumbered, each encounter a wager for survival. Yet amid the chaos, unwritten codes emerged, tacit principles that shaped the behavior of the men who fought, suspended in the air. Aerial combat, since its origins in the First World War, had been imbued with a notion of chivalry. Aviators were seen as duelists, solitary warriors meeting face to face in a space without refuge. Although the Second World War stripped the conflict of many of its traditional forms, that inheritance of honor persisted among veteran pilots. For many, shooting down a doomed adversary was a meaningless act. If a bomber was ablaze, its crew struggling to keep it aloft, finishing it off did not represent victory. It was execution. Instead, a practice emerged among pilots known as the mercy shot, a controlled burst aimed at the engines or fuselage, not to destroy, but to force the enemy to descend, sparing them a prolonged agony. It was an ambiguous gesture, a mixture of compassion and pragmatism, where honor was expressed not through victory, but through restraint. Not all encounters, however, followed this pattern. Strategic pressure, high command orders, and the mounting intensity of the conflict led many squadrons to adopt what became known as prolonged attacks, continuous bursts on already crippled aircraft to ensure their complete destruction. From a tactical perspective, it was a necessary measure. From a human one, it reflected the moral erosion of a war that left no room for noble gestures. Later testimonies from numerous aviators reveal a common thread. The experience of aerial combat was so immediate and solitary that every decision carried absolute weight. In the air, there were no witnesses and no tribunals, only the pilot and his conscience. The extreme conditions, the lack of oxygen, and the constant rattle of shrapnel created an environment where the very notion of justice blurred. Yet even in that setting, an invisible line persisted, one that many refused to cross. The enemy was not an anonymous face, but a reflection of one's own fate. A crippled bomber represented men who, like themselves, were fighting to survive. To bring them down could seem an act of military efficiency, but for others, it was the denial of the last vestige of humanity that could endure in the sky. Thus, while some German pilots clung to the old codes of honor, others accepted the new paradigm, one in which compassion was considered weakness and total destruction, a form of duty. Across the skies of Germany, numerous incidents were recorded in which Luftwaffe pilots encountered severely damaged enemies. On more than one occasion, Allied formations were hit by anti-aircraft fire before interception, leaving some bombers limping through the air with dead engines or shattered wings. In those moments, German fighters faced a dilemma: to finish off a defenseless foe or allow their withdrawal. There are multiple accounts of fighters flying alongside retreating enemy bombers, escorting them out of German airspace as if under a tacit truce. Others simply veered away upon realizing the enemy could no longer return fire. These episodes, though rarely documented in official reports, survived in the memoirs and personal diaries of aviators. They were gestures that escaped the scrutiny of the chain of command, but reflected an inner conviction: war might demand destruction, but not necessarily cruelty. However, as time passed and the military situation worsened, such decisions became increasingly rare. The orders from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium were explicit: every escaping bomber represented a future threat. Territorial defense demanded results, and individual honor began to dissolve before collective urgency. The new pilots, rushed through their training, entered combat without the moral burden of veterans. To them, the enemy was a silhouette in the gun sight, not a fellow being in distress. Air warfare, initially conceived as an engagement between professionals, swiftly turned into a war of attrition. As the Luftwaffe lost its superiority and Allied raids multiplied, the notions of chivalry vanished. Missions became desperate. Fighters took off outnumbered and returned with heavy losses. In that scenario, ethical considerations crumbled before the brutality of statistics. The sky ceased to be a realm of duels and became a board where the only rule was survival. Each encounter was a struggle to retain a fragment of control, and gestures of mercy were replaced by the cold logic of military efficiency. The old codes became whispers of the past, scattered by the wind as younger pilots, born into total war, replaced the knights of the air. When the course of the war began to tilt irrevocably toward the Allies, the German sky ceased to be a territory of control. The Luftwaffe squadrons, exhausted and outnumbered, were pushed into a desperate struggle, a war of resistance rather than dominance. The ideal of the knight of the air faded beneath the weight of a reality in which orders were absolute and mercy a dangerous deviation. Between 1944 and 1945, the skies of Europe filled with young pilots who had barely completed a few hours of flight. Many would never come to know the tacit rules that had once governed aerial warfare. Their training no longer included the notion of respect for the adversary. Their duty was simple: intercept and destroy. The codes of the past, born in the trenches of the First World War and upheld by veterans of the early years, were replaced by a ruthless logic, driven by fear, urgency, and despair. The air, once the domain of gentlemen, was transformed into a floating field of extermination. Each encounter was resolved in seconds, every decision a burst of gunfire. The pilots who survived that final stage did so not only because of their skill, but because they had renounced contemplation. Humanity itself had become a tactical risk. With Germany's surrender in 1945, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist. But in the years that followed, as former enemies reunited at congresses, memorials, and interviews, the memory of those ethical dilemmas resurfaced. Among those who had fought in the skies, on both sides, there endured a silent respect, a tacit understanding that beyond orders and flags, they had shared the same fear and the same burden of responsibility. Later testimonies revealed something the military archives never recorded: the existence of an invisible code that, though eroded by time, never vanished completely. In every pilot who chose not to fire, a spark of humanity was preserved, one that defied the brutality of the conflict. Those gestures, invisible in war reports, became the foundation for what, decades later, would evolve into the modern principles of aerial combat ethics. International conventions and subsequent military regulations took note of those experiences. The recognition that even in war there must exist a moral boundary, that not everything permitted is necessary, was strengthened by the memories of those who, confronted with the enemy, chose not to annihilate him. The mercy shots, the escort gestures, and the voluntary withdrawals became, over time, examples of restraint, lessons on human dignity amid violence. As the years passed, the survivors of that war of altitudes became witnesses to a world that had changed its understanding of combat. In museums, documentaries, and personal accounts, many of them acknowledged that true victories were not always measured by confirmed kills, but by the decisions that preserved something far more valuable: conscience. In a war marked by terrestrial atrocities and extermination camps, the skies retained, if only briefly, the idea that the enemy could still be a human being. The pilots who refused to execute defenseless bombers represented, unknowingly, a silent resistance to the total debasement of the conflict. Their legacy, though hidden in the shadows of history, speaks of an essential truth. Even within destruction, compassion can exist. Today, as we look upon the photographic archives and the rusted remains of those aircraft, we understand that the sky was more than a stage of death. It was also a mirror in which men faced themselves. Aerial warfare, with all its mechanical precision and technological coldness, became a space of moral decisions, where the pilot, isolated amid the roar of the engine and the void, had to choose what kind of man he wished to be. Combat, reduced to the instant of pulling a trigger, concealed an eternal question: how much humanity can survive in the midst of war? In the skies over Germany, among wounded bombers and exhausted fighters, some answered with silence, with respect, with a gentle turn toward another course.